A verse-by-verse study in the book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 39. What does Genesis chapter 36 mean? Genesis returns from describing the scandalous family history of Judah in chapter 38. Here, Scripture resumes a focus on Joseph, sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. Joseph is purchased by a powerful Egyptian official, the captain of the guard. Though Joseph is no longer in the land of promise or with his family, the Lord is still with him. Joseph has not been abandoned. Potiphar, Joseph's master, soon sees that Joseph is successful in all he does. Not only is the Hebrew slave a hard worker and man of integrity, but he is also blessed by his Hebrew God. Before long, Potiphar installs Joseph as the head of his entire household. As a result, everything Joseph is responsible for thrives. Potiphar's household apparently grows in wealth and well-being, and Joseph's God is given the credit. This is about the best outcome Joseph could have hoped for as a slave in Egypt, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 6. A complication arises, however. Like his mother Rachel, Joseph is blessed with exceptional good looks. He is extremely attractive. Soon, Potiphar's wife notices him and decides she will seduce him. Or, rather, she will try. One day she commands him, "Lie with me." Perhaps she made a regular practice of sleeping with her husband's slaves, Genesis 39 verse 7. Joseph knows he is in a terrible position. Given any other command, he would be compelled to obey his master's wife. Yet he knows that sleeping with her would be a clear betrayal of the extraordinary trust Potiphar has put in Joseph. Joseph refuses his master's wife, carefully explaining that he cannot betray Potiphar. More importantly, he will not sin against his God, Genesis 39 verses 8 to 10. Potiphar's wife will not take no for an answer. She continues to attempt to seduce and coerce Joseph into bed with her. He continues to refuse. One day, when no other men are in the household, she grabs him by the cloak and demands once more that he sleep with her. Whether this is a trap or coincidence, the moment is extremely compromising. Instead of arguing, Joseph twists out of his cloak and escapes outside to safety. It's the only way he can avoid both the temptation and the appearance of immorality. He literally runs away rather than be accused of something improper, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 12. Left holding Joseph's cloak, Potiphar's wife is furious. Her lust is converted into rage, and a quest for revenge. She calls to the other male servants for assistance and tells them Joseph attempted to rape her, running away when she screamed. The lie fits. They likely saw Joseph running from the house without his cloak. Her clever lies play on the other servants' resentment of Joseph's success, as well as his race, Genesis 39 verses 13 to 15. Potiphar, as his wife hoped, is enraged by her story. In his anger, he has Joseph thrown into the jail for the king's prisoners. This reaction is strangely subdued. Potiphar likely had the right to kill Joseph outright, and the charge is extremely serious. It's possible that Joseph's reputation for honesty, and a potentially unfaithful history in Potiphar's wife, softened his reaction just enough to keep from having Joseph killed, Genesis 39 verses 16 to 20. It's not fair, of course. Joseph has been falsely accused. It would be natural to expect him to think he had lost God's blessing. However, Scripture is quick to assure us that the Lord was still with Joseph. Even more, God showed Joseph his steadfast love. Though Joseph languished in an Egyptian prison for a crime he didn't commit, he had not been abandoned. As evidence of this fact, God causes the king's jailer to be impressed with Joseph's work ethic, integrity, and success. Soon, Joseph is given charge of nearly all the duties in the prison, much as he had been in Potiphar's house. Because of the Lord's blessing, everything Joseph does continues to succeed, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 24. Soon, this combination of divine blessing, work ethic, and success will bring Joseph to the attention of Pharaoh himself. Genesis 40 verses 9 to 14. Chapter context. In chapter 37, Joseph narrowly escaped being murdered by his own brothers, Genesis 37 verses 18 to 20, only to be sold as a slave, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. Chapter 39 picks up his story after taking a detour into the scandalous life of Judah. Though a slave in Egypt, Joseph thrives under the Lord's blessing. He rises to the top position in his master's household, only to be jailed on a false accusation of attempted rape. Still, Joseph continues to be blessed by God, again rising to become the jailer's most trusted servant. Joseph's reputation and ability to interpret dreams will factor into his rise within the government of Egypt. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. This passage returns to the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. The focus has recently been on Judah, Genesis 38 verse 1, by repeating the last update about Joseph. He was sold into service under Potiphar, the Egyptian captain of the guard. Potiphar would have been the man in charge of Pharaoh's palace soldiers. Pharaoh, at that time, was the title given to the Egyptian king. This makes Joseph's owner a powerful man in a powerful country. Though Joseph has been taken from his home and family, God will continue to protect him and bless his efforts, Genesis 39 verse 2. Context summary. Genesis 39 verses 1 to 18 describes Joseph's rise and fall as the slave of Potiphar, the captain of the guard in Egypt. He arrives in this situation after being sold by his own brothers, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. The Lord continues to be with Joseph and to bless him. Potiphar promotes Joseph to the head manager of his household, even giving credit to the Joseph's God for all the success that follows. Potiphar's wife is also impressed with Joseph, but in a less honorable way. She persistently tempts him to sleep with her. When Joseph refuses, she unfairly frames the young Hebrew slave for attempted rape. Verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Joseph has left behind Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as an inheritance, Genesis 17 verses 1 to 8. He has also been divided from his father Jacob and the rest of the family. He is all alone. Scripture is quick to point out that Joseph has not been abandoned by God. His brothers could have killed him, but Joseph survived when they decided to sell him as a slave, instead, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. Even in captivity in a foreign country, Joseph experiences God's blessings. He could have been ignored, forgotten, or badly abused. Instead, he is placed in the home of a powerful man, Genesis 39 verse 1, and immediately proves his worth. He even comes, in the house of his master, implying that he was trusted and treated well. God's influence in Joseph's abilities is clear, Genesis 39 verse 3. Though he was a slave, he also became the right-hand man of one of the most powerful men in Egypt, serving in Potiphar's own household and effectively running the entire home, Genesis 39 verses 4 to 6. Verse 3. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. From an outsider's perspective, Joseph's life had taken a terrible turn. He had been cruelly betrayed by his jealous brothers and sold into slavery in a foreign country, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. His story did not end there, though, because the Lord remained with Joseph. The evidence of the Lord's presence was that Joseph succeeded in everything he did above and beyond what would have been considered normal for a slave, Genesis 39 verse 2. Potiphar, as well, concluded that Joseph's success was due to the influence of God. It's likely Joseph was quick to give God the credit for his own superb performance. His reputation for success will result in Potiphar giving Joseph enormous trust, Genesis 39 verse 6. Verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. An Egyptian slave could be put to work in many different roles. Potiphar, a powerful man in Egypt, likely had slaves working in fields and doing other outdoor work. He may have had many indoor slaves responsible for various duties. Only the most trusted of slaves could hope to be given responsibility for decisions that otherwise would have been made by the master himself. It would have been extremely unusual for a captive slave to be allowed to oversee everything his master owned, Genesis 39 verses 5 to 6. Joseph's skill and ability are both respected and recognized by Potiphar, Genesis 39 verse 3. Potiphar trusted Joseph, appreciated him, and gave credit to the Lord for Joseph's great success in all he did. As the right-hand man of one of the most powerful leaders in Egypt, Joseph had quickly become a significant man in his own right. Verse 5. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. Once Potiphar put Joseph in charge of his house, God poured out enormous blessing on the household and the fields. The implication is that God increased Potiphar's wealth and well-being in every area where Joseph was responsible. Potiphar benefited in extraordinary ways, apparently, because God blessed Joseph. It was clear and evident to Potiphar that his life was better because of Joseph's God, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 4. This indicates that Joseph understood that he was blessed by God, and he told Potiphar it was God who was responsible for the blessing. Joseph may have seemed arrogant when explaining his dreams to his brothers, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 11. Here, however, he was clearly humble enough before Potiphar to credit the Lord with all his success. In the same way, our lives can bring greater glory to our God when we openly give Him credit for good things that happen to us and through us. Verse 6. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. An employer who feels the need to make every decision, giving no trust to their employees, is sometimes called a micromanager. We have no information of whether Potiphar was a natural micromanager, but the Bible is clear he was not that way with his captive slave, Joseph, Genesis 39 verse 1. Joseph was so successful in overseeing all of Potiphar's household, and the Lord's blessings on the household were so abundant, that Potiphar stopped concerning himself with any of the household business. He just let Joseph handle it all, Genesis 39 verses 2 to 5. Potiphar's only concern, when it came to his household, was what food he would eat. Perhaps this also refers to his most private affairs. Aside from those, Potiphar was convinced Joseph would handle everything as well or better than he could. Again, Potiphar clearly understood that Joseph's success came because of the power and blessing of Joseph's God. He wisely chose to stay out of the way and allow that to continue. Beyond merely being successful and respected, Joseph was a good-looking young man. The description given here is the same as the compliment paid to his mother, Rachel, Genesis 29 verse 17. Apparently, Rachel's son Joseph was stunning to look at. Of course, some advantages come with drawbacks. Joseph's good looks will become a liability at this moment in his life, presenting him with temptation in the form of his master's wife, Genesis 39 verse 7. Verse 7. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." The previous verse described Joseph's stunning good looks, using the same phrase ascribed to his mother, Rachel, Genesis 29 verse 17. At this point, he is both attractive and highly successful, Genesis 39 verses 3 to 6. His master, Potiphar, is the captain of the guard for the ruler of Egypt, Genesis 39 verse 1. Joseph's attributes will now gain him more than respect and attention, they will inspire offers of temptation. Potiphar's wife eventually took notice of Joseph, and has offered herself to him, sexually. It's hard to overstate what a terrible position this put Joseph in. First, as a slave, Joseph would be expected to obey his master's wife in nearly all things. To refuse her instructions could get him in serious trouble. Of course, the command in question would be an outright betrayal of his master, and likely punishable by death. How would Joseph respond? Verse 8. But he refused and said to his master's wife, Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39 verse 1, has put Joseph in a terrible position. Noticing that he is a good-looking, successful young slave, Genesis 39 verse 6, she has demanded he have sex with her. Normally, disobeying the master's wife would hold grave consequences. Sleeping with the master's wife, on the other hand, could also lead to a death sentence for a slave. Joseph's answer is supremely honorable and moral. He refuses to have sex with her, but he makes it clear to Potiphar's wife he is not doing so to avoid punishment. Nor is he concerned about being caught. Rather, he explains the great trust Potiphar has put in him, Genesis 39 verse 9. To violate that trust, even by invitation, would be a despicable sin. Verse 9. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph is explaining to his master's wife, Genesis 39 verse 1, that he will not go to bed with her, as she has demanded, Genesis 39 verse 7. His reasons are not about personal risk or personal danger, but the fact that such a betrayal would be dishonorable. Potiphar has put enormous trust in Joseph. Potiphar trusts Joseph so much that he doesn't even check to see how Joseph is managing all the needs of his large estate. He knows Joseph will do everything with excellence, Genesis 39 verses 4 to 6. In fact, Potiphar has given Joseph equal authority as himself in his own household. Because Potiphar trusts him, Joseph can literally do whatever he likes, whatever is required. The one thing Potiphar has made off-limits to Joseph is his wife, likely not a restriction that needed to be said. If it was mentioned, directly, it might suggest that Potiphar knew his wife was unfaithful. Given the trust with which he's been gifted, Joseph realizes such a sin would be especially heinous. His motive for good behavior is not fear or self-interest, but a sincere conscience. Joseph seeks to live up to the trust and honor placed in him by both Potiphar and the Lord. Verse 10. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. Potiphar is the captain of the Egyptian royal guard and the owner of captive slave Joseph, Genesis 39 verse 1. As it happened, Joseph's diligence and skill led to Potiphar giving him total authority in the home, to great success, Genesis 39 verses 2 to 6. Joseph has also attracted the attention of his master's wife, who tempts Joseph to have sex with her, Genesis 39 verse 7. His refusal is based in an honorable, moral stance. He refuses to betray the confidence of Potiphar or to sin against God, Genesis 39 verses 8 to 9. However, Potiphar's wife may have been the type of noblewoman who was used to getting what she wanted. It's also possible she'd seduced other slaves in the past, Genesis 39 verse 9, because her approach to Joseph is aggressive. She continues to attempt to seduce her husband's servant. The phrasing here suggests her efforts may have become either more subtle or more manipulative, and that Joseph is actively resisting her. Unfortunately for Joseph, his refusal to give in will result in a spiteful reaction from this Egyptian wife, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. Verse 11. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house. Joseph continues to refuse the sexual advances of his master's wife, Genesis 39 verses 7 to 8. He's in a terrible position. Given any other request, Joseph would likely feel compelled to obey his master's wife. Refusing certainly risks making her angry, but accepting would be a likely death sentence, not to mention a heinous sin, Genesis 39 verse 9. It's notable that Potiphar, apparently, told Joseph directly that the only thing in the home to which he did not have full access was the master's wife. That suggests she might have seduced other slaves in the past. This verse reminds us that the persistent sexual harassment against Joseph, Genesis 39 verse 10, is happening in his workplace. His duties required him to be in the house, Genesis 39 verse 3. On this day, Joseph was working inside and none of the other men were present. Whether this was a deliberate scheme on her part, or a coincidence, it's just the moment Potiphar's predatory wife had been waiting for. Verse 12. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Joseph rose to power and authority within the home of Potiphar, captain of the Egyptian royal guard, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 6. This, along with his good looks, has attracted the attention of his master's wife, who has persistently tried to seduce him, Genesis 39 verses 7 to 10. Joseph has refused these advances, making clear that to obey her would be dishonorable to Potiphar and sin against God. Now, the predatory woman has Joseph trapped. Joseph is working inside the house, and all the other men are gone, Genesis 39 verse 11. Potiphar's wife may have arranged for this, that her husband felt led to point out that she was off limits, Genesis 39 verse 9, suggests her unfaithfulness was known. On purpose or not, she took advantage of the moment. She grabbed hold of Joseph's garment, likely meaning his outer cloak, and demanded he have sex with her. Joseph's response to this intense situation is often used as the ultimate example of avoiding even the appearance of sin, no matter what, 2 Timothy 2 verse 22, 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 22, Jude 1 verse 23. He literally twists out of the cloak so he can leave, not even staying in the house or the compromising position. He did the most honorable thing he could think of, embarrassing though it might have been. He wisely ran away both from temptation and from the appearance of sin. Joseph was deeply committed to protecting the character and reputation he had built with his master, as well as protecting the honor of the God who had blessed him. Sadly, his moral reaction will be the last straw for this woman he has continually rejected. She will turn from seduction to slander, seeking revenge on the slave who turned her down, Genesis 39 verse 13. Verse 13. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house. A famous English proverb comes from late 17th century poet William Congreve, who said, "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned." Potiphar's wife has repeatedly offered herself to her husband's young, successful, attractive servant, Genesis 39 verses 1 to 10. He has steadfastly refused for the sake of honor and morality. Finally, when she had Joseph alone and cornered, Genesis 39 verse 11, she aggressively threw herself at him, grabbing his cloak. Joseph, recognizing the danger of the moment, literally left the article of clothing behind rather than stay in such a compromising position. Rather than accepting such an open, apparently risk-free offer, he left her standing there holding his garment. For a woman likely used to getting whatever she wanted, possibly even the sexual use of her husband's slaves, this is a humiliating rejection. Her emotions for Joseph will turn from lust to vicious revenge. Her slander will put Joseph at risk of being immediately executed, Genesis 39 verse 14. Verse 14. She called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39 verses 1 and 7, is livid with Joseph, a slave, for rejecting her repeated sexual advances, Genesis 39 verses 8 to 10. This time, she has thrown herself at him when there was no one else in the house, a perfect opportunity for adultery, Genesis 39 verse 11. Joseph's response was to literally run away, even twisting out of his own cloak to avoid the situation, Genesis 39 verses 12 to 13. For a woman likely used to getting whatever, and whomever, she wanted, this was probably a humiliating reaction. This slave has not merely refused her seduction, he literally ran away. Before Joseph can tell his side of what happened, Potiphar's wife turns from lust to vengeance. A famous English proverb, taken from poet William Congreve, says, "Heaven has no rage like love to hatred turned, nor hell a fury like a woman scorned." Joseph's moral decision earns him a vicious lie, one which could well result in his immediate death. She calls to the other male slaves to come to her aid. Potiphar, she says, brought this Hebrew slave to laugh at, or make sport with, us. The Hebrew root word sachak can imply toying with someone, as in a sexual way, and this is the implication she spells out. She claims Joseph came to rape her, so she screamed. There are layers of strategy in this deception. Potiphar's wife uses the unfortunate circumstances to forge a case against Joseph and gain support from others. Her comment plays on possible resentment towards Potiphar from the other male slaves, criticizing his judgment. She also identifies Joseph by his race. It's possible there was some animosity toward Joseph among the slaves because of his authority over them, and Potiphar's wife is craftily taking advantage of it. Verse 15. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. For the sake of honor and integrity, Joseph has spurned the sexual advances of his master's wife, Genesis 39 verses 6 to 10, even running away with his cloak still in her hand, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 12. She's had enough of his rejection, and her lust turns to hateful revenge. She tells a manipulative lie to the other male servants in the household, Joseph came to rape me, and I screamed, Genesis 39 verses 13 to 14. Her phrasing plays on natural resentment from slaves towards their master, as well as Joseph's racial background. Now she concludes her lie, saying Joseph ran away only because she screamed, and that he left his cloak lying where he took it off before attempting to rape her. Having passed along a false story to the servants of the household, Potiphar's wife will wait for her husband to return home. Joseph's situation seems dire. Who will the master believe, his wife or a captive slave? How will he react to this supposed betrayal? Verse 16. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. Potiphar's wife has executed a brilliant deception. It began with a truth that perhaps the servants had observed with their own eyes: Joseph ran from the house without his cloak on. What they didn't know was that Joseph ran to escape the sexual advances of his master's wife, leaving his cloak in her hands, Genesis 39 verses 7 to 13. Her calculated story was different. She screamed. The servants came running. She told them Joseph had taken the coat off and laid it down beside her while attempting to rape her. Her scream is what sent him running out of the house. She further plays on their resentment for Joseph's success, and his race, by criticizing Potiphar's choice to bring Joseph into the home, Genesis 39 verses 14 to 15. Now she waits with her falsified evidence, Joseph's cloak, until her powerful husband returns home. There's a tragic irony in this moment. Joseph's brothers once used his cloak as a prop supporting their lies, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 34. Once again, his clothes are being used against him. Verse 17. And she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant, whom you have brought among us, came in to me to laugh at me. Seeing the incredible success brought on by God's favor, Joseph's master Potiphar put him in charge of the entire household. Other than making an oddly specific reference to his own wife, Genesis 39 verse 9, the entire home is at Joseph's disposal. The master's affairs are blessed by this, and he trusts Joseph without reservation, Genesis 39 verses 2 to 6. Potiphar's wife also appreciates Joseph, but her interest is sexual. He has repeatedly refused her seduction, to the point of literally running away and leaving his cloak in her hands as she tries to throw herself at him. Genesis 39 verses 7 to 12. This turned her lust into rage, and she lies to the other servants, claiming Joseph tried to rape her. Genesis 39 verses 13 to 15. Potiphar has returned home, and his wife repeats her story to him. Genesis 39 verse 16. She begins again by holding Potiphar responsible, accusing him of being the one who brought a Hebrew to the house. As in her prior statement, Genesis 39 verse 14, the Hebrew root word tzachak, translated as laugh at or make sport of, can have a sexual connotation. Potiphar would have clearly understood that his wife was accusing Joseph of trying to rape her. Verse 18. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. Potiphar's wife concludes her false accusation against Joseph, Genesis 39 verses 7 to 17. She claims Joseph took off his cloak and attempted to rape her, so she screamed, and he ran away. Whether or not Potiphar then spoke to Joseph, or anyone else, we are not told. The following verse suggests that he did not, and that his reaction came only after hearing her words, Genesis 39 verse 19. On one hand, this will be a difficult lie for Potiphar to see through. Joseph was likely seen running from the house without his cloak. The servants heard the scream and then heard the story, albeit a false one, straight from Potiphar's wife. A young, attractive, successful slave might well have let his position go to his head and attempted such a thing. The expected response would be for Potiphar to have Joseph executed immediately, if not to kill the slave himself. On the other hand, Potiphar's wife has been extremely aggressive in her attempts at seduction. And Potiphar gave Joseph a restriction which otherwise would seem to go without saying, that the master's wife was off limits. That, and Potiphar's relatively merciful punishment, Genesis 39 verse 20, suggests he might not have fully trusted his wife's version of the story. Verse 19. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. Potiphar seems to react quickly to his wife's false accusation against Joseph, Genesis 39 verses 11 to 15. Joseph's master, Genesis 39 verse 1, is convinced by her manipulative deception, Genesis 39 verses 16 to 18. She has skillfully cast guilt on her husband for bringing this Hebrew slave into her home. She implies that this attempted rape was, in some ways, her husband's fault. One would expect any husband to become angry when hearing a story such as this. Scripture describes his anger as growing rapidly. It is kindled, or it burned. What complicates the issue is Joseph's stellar reputation. Prior to this moment, Potiphar trusted Joseph with every conceivable decision in the household, Genesis 39 verse 6. That Joseph was adamant about not sleeping with his master's wife suggests that his moral character was well known, Genesis 39 verses 8 and 10. At the same time, her aggressive attempts and Potiphar's strangely specific comment about her being off-limits, Genesis 39 verse 9, suggest she may have had a reputation for this kind of thing. Whatever details go through Potiphar's mind, he's angry. There is zero chance he will let this pass. In that time and place, a master likely had the right to kill a slave like Joseph outright. This is what many husbands would be tempted to do. Fortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's reaction will be merciful, so to speak, Genesis 39 verse 20. Context summary: Genesis 39 verses 19 to 23 describes Joseph's arrival in the Egyptian prison reserved for the king's prisoners. Joseph's once trusting master has him jailed after the master's wife falsely accuses Joseph of attempted rape. Despite the unfair imprisonment, God has not abandoned Joseph. That Joseph isn't immediately executed speaks well of both his reputation and the Lord's protection. Even in prison, Joseph is blessed. The king's jailer favors Joseph and quickly puts him in charge of nearly all of duties in the jail. Joseph continues to succeed in every circumstance he faces, under God's provision. Verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Joseph has not only done nothing wrong, but he has also gone above and beyond to do everything right. He has worked diligently for his master, Genesis 39 verses 1-5, despite being a captive slave. He has adamantly rejected seduction from his master's wife, Genesis 39 verses 6-10. The Lord has been with Joseph, and Potiphar has benefited from the blessings God has heaped on everything Joseph did. Joseph has acted with integrity and uprightness. So why have Joseph's circumstances suddenly reversed? After he honorably refused the sexual advances of his master's wife, her lust turned to vengeance. She lied, convincing Potiphar that Joseph had tried to rape her, Genesis 39 verses 11-19. Potiphar believed her and burned with anger, as any husband would. He immediately throws Joseph in a jail, seemingly attached to his own home, and reserved for prisoners of the king, Genesis 40 verse 2. Considering the circumstances, Joseph could have been murdered on the spot by a jealous husband. He could have been sentenced to death. Instead, as when he was sold by his treacherous brothers, Genesis 37 verses 26-28, he will live on, giving further opportunity for God to work his master plan, Genesis 45 verse 5, 50:20. Events such as this give challenging answers to common questions. Do only good things happen to those who honor the Lord? Do bad circumstances always signal God's anger with a person? Joseph's story makes it clear neither is the case, John 16 verse 33. Joseph has done no wrong, yet he suffers. Still, the Lord has not left his servant. He remains with Joseph in every circumstance, even the unfair and difficult ones. He even continues to enable Joseph's success, Genesis 39 verses 21-23. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Joseph's circumstances have radically reversed overnight. His previous lofty position as the servant in charge of his powerful master's household is over, Genesis 39 verse 6. Now he's a prisoner in the king's prison for a crime he didn't commit, Genesis 39 verses 7-15. It's clearly not fair. However, Scripture is quick to reassure us that Joseph's apparent bad fortune does not mean God has abandoned him. Just the opposite is true, the Lord remains with Joseph. Joseph was sold as a slave, Genesis 37 verses 26-28, but this was better than being murdered, Genesis 37 verses 18-20. He was jailed on a false charge of attempted rape, Genesis 39 verses 16-20, but this was better than being summarily executed. These events are difficult to endure, but they happen for a reason, Genesis 45 verse 5, 50:20. Even now, God is showing his steadfast love to Joseph in the middle of terrible circumstances. God will bless Joseph and cause him to thrive even inside of prison, Genesis 39 verses 22-23. The Lord causes the jailer to favor Joseph, improving his quality of life in a place that could be quite difficult. Joseph's entire life is marked by respect from those in authority because of his faithful work ethic, his integrity, and especially because of the Lord's blessing. Verse 22. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Despite being innocent, Joseph is in the king's prison, Genesis 39 verses 20-21. Seen from an earthly point of view, his prospects are bleak. The Egyptian pharaoh's prisoners could be executed without warning. Given that he was falsely accused of rape, Genesis 39 verses 7-15, he is lucky to be alive, at all. Joseph's sentence did not include a release date. He faced the very real possibility of living the rest of his life in this prison, and he was still a young man. Joseph could have responded by withdrawing into himself. He could have refused to interact with anyone, or by cursing the God who had allowed him to be sold into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28, and then unfairly jailed. Instead, Joseph again chose to live and serve others with integrity as a man who was blessed, not cursed, by his Lord. He seems to recognize that he has, at least twice, escaped death at the hands of his enemies, and been given an opportunity to prove himself. Once more, the blessing of the Lord resulted in Joseph receiving increased responsibility. His success leads to further opportunities, which in turn are also successful. This time, the king's jailer notices Joseph's faithfulness, integrity, and successful work. Eventually, just as Potiphar had done, Genesis 39 verse 1, the jailer put Joseph in charge of all his own responsibilities, Genesis 39 verse 23. Verse 23. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Once again, Joseph found himself impressively blessed by God. Once again, he responded by working with integrity and faithfulness. After narrowly escaping death at the hands of his brothers, Genesis 37 verses 18 to 20, Joseph was sold as a slave to an Egyptian master, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28, 39:1. There, his ability led to being put in charge of the entire household, Genesis 39 verses 2 to 6. His master's wife, enraged when Joseph refused her seduction, Genesis 39 verses 7 to 12, concocted a false charge of attempted rape, Genesis 39 verses 13 to 18. Rather than being immediately executed, Joseph has been thrown into prison, Genesis 39 verses 19 to 20. This time, it is the keeper of the jail who sees Joseph repeatedly succeed at all he does. Again, it seems Joseph makes a point of giving credit to God for his success. The jail keeper seems to give that credit to the Lord, as well. In fact, the king's jailer comes to trust Joseph, a prisoner accused of attempted rape, so deeply that he stops even supervising anything Joseph is responsible for. The impression given is that Joseph has the run of the prison to do whatever is needed in serving others. He does it all with excellence, Genesis 39 verses 21 to 22. End of chapter 39. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.